Welcome back to This Week in Bevy. This week we've got a whole host of showcases, including some new Steam pages, the release of a Hanabi particle editor, and deterministic replication with Avian and Lightyear. Upstream Bevy also sees a number of PRs, including some reorganizing of rendering with a new Bevy Light crate and a Friendlier Entity Debug implementation. We also see a new engine built for TypeScript and powered by Bevy with a Dino core interface and the open sourcing of some vegetation. And let's kick it off with scenes without Bevy render. As a result of a number of PRs, 20051 adds release notes for being able to define scenes without depending on the Bevy render crate, which enables the use of cameras, lights, and meshes without third-party custom renderers. And if you're interested in performance work, 17976 is a great example of what traces can look like with before and after examples. If you're interested in trying to figure out tracing, maybe you could try to replicate the before and then the after. And previously, Entities Debug implementation leaked a bit of the internals, which isn't necessarily problematic, but was very unhelpful to people who were just deriving debug on entity-containing types. 20045 changes us to only use the index and version information, like 42v0. And 19991 introduces Bevy Light, a new crate containing Bevy's lighting implementations. The new crate serves to make lights usable without the Bevy render crate. And of course, as every week, Alice's merge train is a maintainer level view into active PRs and how the Bevy sausage is made. This is typically posted on Blue Sky and on Mastodon, so if you're interested, definitely give her a follow on one of those platforms. And kicking things off for the showcases, this is deterministic replication with Avian and Lightyear. Deterministic replication is when you don't replicate state at all, but instead you only send inputs through the network. The games should stay in sync, provided it's deterministic. Lightyear was historically only intended for state replication, so adding deterministic replication is an interesting step forward. In this example, no state is replicated, only the inputs. It has 100 millisecond latency, 15% jitter, and 2% packet loss. And next up, we've got the first of two mentions of Exofactory this week. This is the Exofactory Steam page having been accepted. This is a factory builder or automation game where you awaken as a forgotten AI on an alien world. Your choice reshapes your technology, environment, and identity. Automate deeply transformative factories in a chill open world where the story evolves uniquely around you. The current release date is scheduled as Q4 2025. And next up, we've got a small physics platformer that uses LDTK for level spawning and Rapier for physics. An animation manager was included in this work as well. And next up, we've got the design for an input rebinding menu. Not flashy gameplay, but important nonetheless. This implementation is based on enums, impls, and loops. And then we've got some work from the Polders creator. This is in progress vegetation shaders, including grass and bushes. The source for the bush shader actually was released as open source later in the week, so definitely go check that link out on the website if you're interested in it. And then we've got something of a simpler showcase. This is a work in progress dialogue system for a 3D game. And Michael does a bunch of work on stream on this MMO game. This is working doors, which were added to the multiplayer online role-playing game being worked on in this Twitch stream. The next screen is going to be much lighter. This is progress on a trajectory planner for a space-related game. The game involves lots of flying around one-to-one star systems using a torch drive, and for the travel system to work, these trajectories need to be pre-computable. The trouble is that computing a trajectory can accurately hit a target, which will have moved in the few days it takes you to get there, is really hard. There's no analytical solution. The solution here is a curve to account for the velocity of the planet you're trying to meet up with. And this is Modelito, a CAD application in Bevy looking for collaborators. The prototype works with SDFs, that's signed distance fields, with a kernel to make them easier to use and constructive solid geometry. There's a racket DSL that's intended to expand and an intent to not make all of the users of the application code. Next up, we've got a smooth number line axis zoom with multiple levels of ticks. If you're paying attention, you may realize that this is actually related to D&D timelines. The demo is using about 14,000 rectangular sprites and scaling. And this is Deep Field, which is an in-progress multiplayer realistic space combat simulator, which is now in alpha. What you're seeing here is part of a YouTube video, so if you're interested in this game, definitely go check out the video, which gives a ton more in-depth detail. And next up, we've got a compute shader simulation of tectonic uplift, erosion, and climate. It runs at 70 FPS at 4K in 2D. 12 FPS with a naive 3D implementation with a single planar height map, with vertex positions displaced in a vertex shader. There are some details about the erosion algorithm and links to a bunch of papers that were used if you want to check them out on the website. And our next showcase is an Avian3d Car Sandbox. This is progress on an Avian3d based car physics sandbox, including new track modularity and a track generator. This is an ongoing sandbox with multiple weeks of development put into it, so if you're interested, definitely check out the author. And then we've got a super interesting cross-language showcase. This is a TypeScript and Bevy featuring Dino Core application. This is a TypeScript object-oriented programming game engine that runs entirely in Bevy using Dino Core. Bevy renders the TypeScript world and receives deltas of changed TypeScript components, and TypeScript has access to create inspector interfaces via tools like eGUI APIs, and everything is sandboxed. It also works headlessly. And we've seen this in a number of previous issues at this point, but this is Drakkar VFX. This is Jarl's editor for Particle 2D effects that is now open source. The editor is based on Bevy Hanabi and focuses on 2D particle effects, although 3D can be supported as well. Although notably, I believe the version matches versions that were used in Jarl, which includes depending on a forked version of Bevy Hanabi 0.7. This in turn means that the first release of open source supports a relatively old version of Bevy, that is 0.11. This is also correspondingly a fairly old version of Hanabi at 0.17. And last up in our showcases, this is a level of detail generator for chunks, a chunk LOD generator that divides chunks into smaller ones, going in this example from red chunks to blue chunks to green chunks, that is biggest to smallest. And that brings us into the crates with greedytile. This is a tile-constrained pattern synthesis algorithm like wave function collapse. It adds in longer-range interpixel statistics, a pixel ratio correction mechanism, and local rollback to prevent unknown tiles. It's 100% safe rust with both library and CLI interfaces. And then we've got Bevy SDF Clown, which is a prototype crate. Bevy SDF Clown is a general-purpose signed distance field, or SDF, rendering plugin for Bevy. It supports dynamic SDF composition, material shading, and runtime scene manipulation. This is a prototype release with a runnable example in the repo. Which brings us to the devlogs this week. This is Exofactory, terrain, animation, and major work done. Exofactory is an automation and factory building game. This devlog covers new terrain systems, animation, 3D assets, and the Steam acceptance. And we've seen this a couple of times, but this is Beet, which they're titling their devlog Full Moon Harvest. This marks the first release candidate for Beet's web meta framework features, with the website and blog post rendered entirely with Bevy. And finally, in the educational section, we've got this gist, which is for a settings UI. The gist builds this interface. This is the source code for it with tabs and sliders for the settings menu for a game Healing Spirit that is in development. It uses Bevy Hammer UI and immediate mode paradigms, so check out the gist if you're interested. And as always, it's important to mention that if you want to get involved, the way that Bevy works open source wise is that you can review pull requests. If you are interested in Bevy and you don't feel qualified, the kind of review you can do is running examples to make sure they run on, say, Mac OS or Windows or Linux or your distribution, the one that you care about. If you've been working with Bevy for a little bit longer, you can start to provide more substantial review. And this is a great way to get started and increase your involvement in the Bevy project over time. We always have the pull requests that were opened and merged this week over on the website, thisweekinbevy.com. And that's it for me this week. Have a great rest of yours, and I'll see you in the next one.